This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, investigative journalist Amelia Pang reports on labor camps in China used to produce U.S. consumer goods. Her book, Made in China, A Prisoner and SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. She's interviewed by Yan Bennett of Princeton University's Center on Contemporary China.
So thank you today for coming today, Amelia. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your book and what motivated you to write it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So the book starts in 2012 when an American woman named Julie Keith opens up this brand new package of Halloween decorations from Kmart. And out falls an SOS letter that's handwritten by the political prisoner in China who had made and packaged this very product. So the book follows his story, how he ended up in a labor camp. And it also zooms out to examine some of the issues in our supply chain and the really flawed ways that a lot of corporations are auditing their Chinese factories. It looks at all the different factors that contributed to making it really easy for something that was made in a labor camp in Liaoning, China, to end up selling at a Kmart in Portland, Oregon.
So can you tell us some reasons why people are locked up in China and how they end up in these forced labor prisons?
Yes, a lot of these people are political prisoners, like civil rights lawyers, pro-democracy activists, religious activists like the underground Christians, the Falun Gong group, Tibetans, and a lot of ethnic minorities such as Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities. And there's also some petty criminals as well. A lot of these people haven't necessarily committed any kind of violent or real crime per se. These are people the Chinese government would like to silence and help them and try to push them to assimilate more to whatever the Chinese policy is at the moment.
So you would call them prisoners of conscience, right?
Yes, a lot of them are prisoners of conscience.
So I was wondering if you could tell our American audience about the conditions for these prisoners in these camps and prisons. I think some of us may be under the impression that these Chinese labor prisons are the same as American prisons that produce license plates, for example.
Right. That's a very good point. Of course, we do have a lot of American prisoners working for companies as well. And that is a whole other issue and not exactly innocent either. But the scale is much larger in China and the conditions of the prisons are worse because historically these original camps were based off of Soviet gulags. There are places where people are tortured and the conditions are very, very grueling. Sometimes they have to work 15 hours a day, up to 24 hours a day to meet production deadlines. As bad as American prisons are, these places are actually worse.
So you mentioned in your book that Sun Yi is the story that you follow. He had to endure forced feedings. He didn't get enough to eat. He slept, I think it was 6 to a bed at one point, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, right. One of the ways that they tried to force someone to give up their religion, and this was Sun Yi's case, was to have them sign papers to say that they had given up their religion and they had completely given up their faith. And if they refused to sign it, they would either not be given enough food or I think one of the things that Sun Yi did was to do a hunger strike to stand up against his treatment. And he went quite a long time without eating to the point where he started to become severely mentally ill and severely malnourished, could barely move. So he was tortured pretty badly in the camp.
Wow. So you mentioned that you started following the story in 2012. So can you talk about the state of prison labor camps today?
It has changed very much and actually gotten worse today with the expansion of the Uyghur re-education camps and the mass transfer of the Uyghurs to factories outside of Xinjiang through the Uyghur labor transfer program.
So could you talk a little bit more about the re-education camps in Xinjiang, which I've heard has been determined as the largest mass internment of a minority since World War II? And the reaction of governments to that, I know that the United States has come out, or at least the U.S. Congress has come out condemning this, the practice in China.
Yes, absolutely. It is truly a very disturbing development. What's happening to the Uyghurs right now actually it actually meets the UN's definition of genocide. Mm-hmm. A lot of times in the camps and even outside of the camps, they are forced to undergo forced sterilization, forced abortions, and these kinds of procedures. It actually led to an 84% decrease in the population of two of the largest Uyghur prefectures in China.
Wow.
And that 84% decline happened in 2015 to 2018 alone, just those years. It's really a pretty significant decline. And it meets one of the 5 UN criteria for genocide, which is suppression of birth.
Mm-hmm. So I believe the U.S. Congress also came out in December saying that this was officially a genocide. Is that correct?
Yes, the U.S. government was the first to say that.
Yeah. So also in December, the EU and China recently agreed to conclude an investment agreement. They haven't actually signed it yet. So China has stated it will try to make continued and sustained efforts to ratify international conventions on banning forced labor, of which the EU has 2 conventions, the Forced Labor Convention, the Abolition of Forced Labor. So I was wondering if you could speak to China's past commitments, if they have made any, and what you think about the EU investment agreement and enforcement of, the ban on forced labor.
I personally do not think there's much evidence to believe that China will really hold up their word this time. Mm-hmm. In the past, looking at past Chinese and U.S. agreements, China has not held up their end of the agreement. For example, as early on as the early 90s, the U.S. government had a memorandum of understanding with China, which would essentially mean that China must stop exporting forced labor or any kind of prison labor goods to the U.S. and give the U.S. the ability to go and inspect the prisons to make sure that they're not exporting these products. But in reality, as we know, these kinds of products are still entering our stores and our borders. And the reality is a lot of times Customs and Border Patrol is not allowed to go and inspect these facilities the way that in the agreements they say they can. Mm-hmm. So I am not confident that China will do anything differently this time with the EU.
Okay. So both the EU and the United States have bans on importation of goods made from forced labor. So you speak a little bit about this in your book. How good are governments in enforcing these bans?
They're not very good because it's very hard to get hard evidence. And there's, reasons for that. You don't want to accidentally ban a factory that isn't using forced labor. You want to be fair. But I mean, it is truly difficult to get eyewitness accounts for a lot of these cases, especially in Xinjiang right now. Auditors can't. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about how auditors can't even go there now to independently investigate. How do you get hard evidence that, or any kind of evidence in how these factories are actually making the products? But without the evidence, then it's really hard to issue a ban. This actually didn't make it into the book in time for the deadline, but the ban on certain regional products in Xinjiang was a significant development. It hadn't happened before in the history of CBP, Customs and Border Patrol policies. And it's a very positive step, the banning of all tomato products and all cotton products from Xinjiang.
Can you go into a little bit about how the process that auditors have and the obstacles and impediments to them actually finding out the truth in China?
Yes, that is a big topic. There's a whole chapter in my book just about that. Well, first of all, there are many different kinds of audits. If a company says, oh, we did an audit and we found no evidence of forced labor here, that doesn't mean anything, because what kind of an audit did they do? There are standard audits that might cost a couple $100. Those typically check for very surface level things like cleanliness of the factory, how good the equipment is, how good the products are, those kind of basic things. They often don't even interview the workers. They can't detect something as complex and hidden as kind of illegal and hidden subcontracting to labor camps. So if their standard audit did not find evidence of forced labor, that doesn't mean anything. There's another kind of audit that would cost around $1,000 or more, where they do interview the workers and they look at wage documents and things like that. But those cost a lot more, and I don't know how many companies are actually doing those kinds of audits. But even those, I've heard from Chinese auditors have a hard time proving that these hidden subcontracts or forced labor is happening. And then you have another tier of audits that cost $5,000 and take about 5 days to do. And they're very thorough. They cross-analyze the wages of multiple departments in that factory to see if there's any inconsistencies about how much they're producing and how much they're paying workers. And I've heard from Chinese factory auditors that might be one of the only ways to detect illegal and unauthorized subcontracting to forced labor. But how many companies are realistically paying $5,000 per audit for all of their factories? So that's one of the big problems with the auditing system. And another big problem is that audits, who designs the audits? The audits are designed to essentially help the corporation look good in times of crisis. Say, oh, look, we did our checks and this is, we've done everything we can to prevent forced labor. But it's not really designed to actually really detect forced labor in the supply chain.
So also in that chapter, you talk about how there's an entire cottage industry of that makes fake receipts, essentially, and fake records and, counterfeit, the things that you stamp to go in and out. I forget what those are called.
Yeah, like there's fake timesheet records.
Timesheets, that's it.
Yeah, that companies will sell to the factories, and they were, unfortunately, a lot of these are made by former auditors, so they know exactly what the auditors are looking for and how to fool them. And it's terrible. So that makes it extremely difficult to detect hidden subcontracts in the factories. But we also have to look at why are factories turning to, these kinds of illegal companies to fake their records. A lot of times it's because they cannot realistically make the products for that cheap of a price and for that short of a deadline. And that comes back to how companies are sourcing the products, their business practices, which also goes back to consumers. We reward the companies who can offer the cheapest prices for the latest trends. And so the production deadlines are just getting shorter and shorter, and people are demanding cheaper and cheaper prices. And that is fundamentally unsustainable.
Okay. So what can we do as consumers to purchase ethically?
You know, it's a question I've thought about a lot. I wish we could say that there's just one company, that specific company or a specific type of product that's guaranteed to not have any kind of forced labor in the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm finding that harder and harder to say because, you know, right now the Uyghur re-education camps, we're seeing them making all kinds of products, from the human hair extensions that's getting popular these days.
Oh, wow.
Even the raw materials for solar panels. It's such a wide range of products. So I think ultimately what we can do as educated consumers is the next time we go shopping online at our favorite brands, take a moment to stop and look at their sustainability page or their corporate social responsibility page. Most companies these days have either one or both of these pages, and see what it says.
Mm-hmm.
Made in China is about educating consumers how to analyze those pages.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, you know, the company might list a list of their factories, and to the unknowing consumer, that might seem really sustainable and very transparent, but it's really not enough for a company to simply name the names of their factories. They have to start showing how are they auditing their factories? How much effort are they really putting into making sure that they are not encouraging their factories to use forced labor by offering them such cheap prices? You know, they really need to start revealing how much are they paying these factories, and can that realistically support the wages for that county or that city? And if not, maybe we as consumers need to be willing to pay higher prices or buy less products. It's just unsustainably cheap. A lot of these products are.
Okay. So I know that you're a new parent, and I'm a parent of 2 girls, and they're growing. I just bought, I don't know, half a dozen new pants for my daughter. And, that's the thing. I'm constantly buying things as a parent. So how do we balance this as consumers in America? We need a lot of products, a lot of cheap products. Yet we want, I don't want products that are made by prison labor,
Absolutely. That's a great question. We do need to buy a lot of things, and not everyone can afford to buy everything from a locally made source, or a lot of times you can't even buy everything from a local shop like that. So you do have to buy some made in China products at least. I think the issue is not necessarily about avoiding. I think the solution is not necessarily about avoiding all made in China products or avoiding all of one particular company, but really encouraging our companies to really improve the way that they source from these factories, and using our dollars to support the factories that start to change and encourage that kind of a shift in business.
Mm-hmm. So what are some companies doing, the ones that operate in China? What are they doing to try and regulate this, or at least, prohibit subcontractors, for example, from coming in and providing products that are made with prison labor?
I don't think they're doing much at the moment because nobody has asked them to up until this point, So I'm really hoping to change just start a new conversation about what transparency actually means.
Okay. So I thought it was really interesting in the book, in the chapter Desire and Denial, you talk about the ethical dilemma this poses to consumers and the processing of complex ethical dilemmas neurologically. Can you talk about that? I thought that was fascinating.
Thank you. Yes, everybody buys cheap things. I've bought a lot of cheap things in my lifetime, and we really, it makes us really happy whenever we see a big discount and whenever we feel like we're getting a big discount. So I think being aware of some of these processes when you're buying can help you can help you refrain from just simply buying things because it's cheap. And it can help you to think, to put more thought into whether you actually need a product, or if you already have a similar version of this. That it can lead to more thoughtful consumption. And I interviewed a psychologist who actually talked about there being a certain threshold. If you hear about something that is disturbing enough about a particular brand or product, then at a certain point, the cheapness of the price no longer is so desirable anymore. You can't overlook it at a certain point. And I think with all the information we're finding out about the Uyghur re-education camps and its associations with a genocide, I think it's going to be the start of a shift in our wider consumer culture, where we start to care less about the cheapness of the price.
Very good. So I just want to go back to Sunyi's story. So one of the changes that came out about his SOS letter, it got out into the news in Oregon and across the globe. So one of the changes China did was to rename the re-education camps to compulsory isolation detox centers, right? So can you talk a little bit about what, how the government in China is complicit with, this whole prison labor system and how it's reinforcing it in a way?
Yes, the re-education through labor camps have pretty much not gone away at all. They've been renamed as compulsory isolation drug detox centers. The name just is so eerie. It makes me almost laugh uncomfortably every time I hear it.
Are they really in drug rehab?
Compulsory isolation. Yeah. No, not at all. I actually visited some of these facilities and the guards at the so-called drug detox centers, and the guards will call these places prisons over and over again. In our conversation towards the end, I asked them, wait, is this a prison or a drug detox center? And they had to stop and think about it and say, oh, no, this is a drug detox center. And it looks exactly the same as it did before it got changed into drug detox center. There's barbed wires everywhere. There's just a lot of guards walking around. You don't see any people coming in and out that are actually like families coming to visit or anything like that. It looks very much like a prison. And they sell all kinds of products there. And the guards, they're almost less guards, but more like businessmen. I told them I was with a foreign company that wanted to buy from them, and they were so friendly. They told me all about the products they made inside, and really they were more like salespeople than guards. They were very, it really shocked me just how used to they were to selling to foreign companies and how comfortable they were with that. I spent a lot of time just waiting outside of these camps and following the freight trucks that left to see exactly which manufacturers they were working with. And, they went to all kinds of exporters, including an Apple factory. And I looked at the customs records for that particular factory, and they are exporting to the US, they're exporting to Central America, they're exporting to Europe. And these products made in so-called closed camps are really still camps, and they're really still going all over the world.
So do you have a sense of how much of the goods coming out of China is made with prison labor?
It's really hard to say. I wish, because we don't have any big hard data. We just have these little bits of data coming from different organizations and different journalists who've been able to track them down here and there. I mean, we don't have a database that the Chinese government releases that we can trust. So it's really hard to say. Some estimate maybe 20%, but it's hard because what counts, a lot of times something might not be fully made in a forced labor prison. It could just be the raw materials, or it could just be the packaging, or it could just be one component.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to say exactly how much of the supply chain is tainted.
See, so another horrific practice in China that you mentioned in your book is organ harvesting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Survivors and family members who've gotten their loved ones' corpses afterward have said they tend to see some weird scars and some that seem to suggest that the organs have been taken from these prisoners. So that leads many people to suspect that they were executed for the express purpose of for their organs to be sold.
Also, you mentioned too, some of the prisoners that are taken in for medical exams, just unknown for whatever reason that they don't know about. Right.
It's very strange, and they're not given any updates about what were the results of their exams. And there are many instances where they've been injured in the camps, or they've been tortured and injured, and they didn't receive medical treatment. So it's very odd that they will suddenly get medical treatment sometimes for an exam.
Okay.
Most of them not. Yeah.
So an underlying theme of your book is that is how the Chinese engage in civil disobedience in China and how dangerous that is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. It's unfortunately there's not a large part of the Chinese population that is engaging in any kind of civil disobedience, or even willing to read news that wasn't published by the Chinese government because it's just too risky. I mean, the situation in China has changed so much since the Tiananmen protests in 1989, when you used to see, student protesters walking around the street. They're not so, just the way that they spoke and their hopes for their future was not so different from, Black Lives Matter protesters you see today in the U.S. There really was this sense that China was moving towards a democracy. And that so many people were fighting for and so many people cared about. But today in China, if you talk to anyone, including young people, no, there's a uniform opinion that democracy, the Western concept of democracy, is not for China due to China's different cultural and historical experiences. And to any kind of discussion about democracy, pro-democracy activism is U.S. propaganda. That seemed to be a widely believed concept around that most people have accepted. So there's really a very, very small percentage of people that's even willing to take up this fight for a freer China.
I know that they call them citizen journalists who were reporting on COVID-19 in Wuhan. They've been jailed and received sentences for speaking up and telling the truth about COVID. So in the course of researching for this book and doing investigative journalism in China, did you encounter these citizen journalists?
I was too afraid to contact them directly while I was in China. I communicated with them when I was in the U.S. Electronically, because I didn't want to go to China and bring them trouble. But yes, they are still around, and they are putting great risk to their own lives to raise awareness to various issues, including something as important as real information about COVID infections in Wuhan. Which it's very unfortunate that a lot of the journalists have been sentenced to prison for reporting on COVID originally. And, if they're not held in isolation, then they're probably doing forced labor and making goods for people like us.
Also, too, in Hong Kong, something like 50 pro-democracy activists have been arrested. So I think for our American audience, we're so used to having rights. It's all in the First Amendment, right? Right to free speech, right to assembly, right to, have civil rights, right? So can you talk a little bit about how different it is in China, just to give our American audience an understanding?
Yes, absolutely. It's a huge difference between Hong Kong and China and mainland China. Right? There's a lot of people in Hong Kong who will talk about civil rights and advocating for that. But in China, it's like speaking an entirely different language. They see it all as so-called U.S. propaganda. A lot of them have seen and experienced the trauma of events like the Cultural Revolution. So to this generation and the generations that came after, they just want a stable life. They just want to be able to earn money and be able to put food on the table, and not get sent to prison arbitrarily. They just want to stay in line. I think civil rights is just not really a high priority on a lot of these people's minds at the moment.
Mm-hmm. So I want to touch on what is it like to engage in investigative journalism in China as a foreigner, and how this is different than from the United States or in Europe, for example?
Right. Yes. When I was preparing to go to China, I had to think a lot about whether I wanted to go on a journalism visa or a tourism visa. And if I'm going to do journalism in Europe, I'm definitely going to go on a journalism visa. You have a lot more protections. And there's a lot of times the publication and the publisher would want you to, and there's no real reason not to. But in China, it's a very different story. If you go on a journalism visa, it automatically flags you to the police. So the moment you arrive, you're going to get followed. You're going to get stopped a lot. You're going to probably be held in detention, just to waste your time and prevent you from getting any reporting done. Wow. And while you have a lot of protections as a foreign journalist in China on a journalism visa, you really have to find very creative ways to trick the police. I know one reporter who said he would book hotels in multiple cities or multiple counties at the same time to confuse the police about where he was staying that night. And just you have to do things like that to get around. I ultimately decided to go on a tourism visa so that I wouldn't get tracked. And that worked. I stuck pretty closely to big tourist sites. For example, Qingpu, Shanghai, which people say is known as the Venice of China, is this beautiful ancient water town. But just, a 10-minute drive away, there's a whole compound of labor camps. You just drive 10 minutes away and you see guards, you see the barbed wires, and you really don't have to even wander far to come across them.
So since you went on a tourist visa, were you fearful of, if they found out you're doing actually journalism instead of tourism, were you fearful that you would be detained or imprisoned or anything like that?
I was nervous, but I was pretty sure that even if I got detained, I would have been fine in the end. They probably would not have actually sentenced me to prison in China. I don't think they've ever done that to a foreign journalist, even if you're not on a journalist visa. But they will try to scare you, and they might even beat you up a little bit, but they're not going to kill you the way that they could to a citizen journalist who's a Chinese national. So I felt I was in a better position to do reporting on this than a lot of other people in China.
So I wanted to ask you about that. Since you look Chinese, right? Were you taken as a native in doing this?
Yes. I went there and I spoke Chinese I spoke Mandarin with the guards, and they couldn't really tell that I was I was a foreigner. So I got lucky. I just passed through. Yeah.
Do you think that you got more information that way because you didn't look like a foreigner or sound like a foreigner?
Yes. They were not guarded at all when they talked to me, which surprised me, just how much information these guards reveal to me when you show up at the campsites.
A complete stranger.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to ask you, so part of the narrative of your book includes how mass consumerism is contributing to climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that, as well as the movement for more sustainable and ethical consumption, and how do we as a society foster that?
Absolutely. That's a great point. I think anybody who cares about climate change should care about the labor camps in China, because these are large, large factories that a lot of them are not being tracked in terms of whether they're meeting emission standards or not, how much emissions they're contributing to the atmosphere. And they absolutely need to be tracked in order to realistically reduce emissions for our Earth.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that there's some generational differences, like baby boomers have different consuming patterns than Gen Zers and millennials. And you talk about this in your book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. There's definitely a change, a generational shift, where you see a lot of the younger people, like the Gen Z populations, that are a lot more interested in ethical consumption. They're actually willing to pay higher prices if they could know that it was ethically made. They're still buying cheap goods from stores like Forever 21. By all means, they still are, but that's not the only goods they're buying. They're even willing to shop less and buy one really expensive thing that's well made. This is a huge difference from the previous generations, which was all about buying as many cheap things as you can.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned some companies in your book, and they all seem to be related to fashion, like Forever 21, H&M, even Target, all these fast fashion companies. Is there any push to have these fast fashion companies, adopt standards for themselves?
I think so. And I think they try to say that they already are doing this. Even the fast fashion companies like H&M do list like their complete list of suppliers to make them look sustainable. But again, it doesn't do enough to just list your list of suppliers, because companies like H&M we've found SOS letters associated with their products. For example, in as late as 2019, there was an SOS letter discovered in a product. This was discovered in a box of Christmas cards, and it was from Qingpu Prison, which is where I went to in Shanghai to look at the camps, and that prison was also associated with H&M. So we have a lot of evidence that this particular prison is exporting products from all these different brands. And there was actually a former prisoner who witnessed H&M logos being made in that prison. And he tried to contact H&M. I've tried to contact H&M about it. And all they say is they are unable to find evidence. They have not really told me much about if they've changed their business practices, or if they're even looked into which business practices contributed to, their product being seen in a prison camp. And just, maybe 10 to 15 minutes away from this Qingpu prison is an H&M factory.
Wow.
And you go there, and you talk to the guards. I mean, not the guards. You talk to the workers there, and they say, "Oh, we subcontract a lot of our products, and we don't know exactly where." So, I would find it hard to believe that H&M really doesn't have any prison labor in their supply chain, and even though they list their factories. So, I think fast fashion companies really need to do a lot more to try to source sustainably. And it's not just fast fashion companies, but also ultra fast fashion companies that we're seeing these days. Companies like Boohoo and ASOS, they're a new breed that they don't have brick and mortar stores. So They're only online, and they can just get things up even faster, and change the trends even faster. And so that in turn reduces the production time even more, and further contributes to encouraging factories to outsource work to forced laborers.
Wow. So you mentioned in your book that like Gen Zers and millennials, they're not so brand conscious as, as other generations are. So for instance, I go on Amazon and I'm looking for a dress, for example, and I find a ton of dresses and they all have these kind of strange names. They're all Chinese made, right? I guess it's so prevalent. It just seems so prevalent. Like all the products come out of China. Everything comes out of China, right? So I just want to circle back to the point. What can we do as consumers? Because it just seems to me overwhelming. It seems that everything comes out of China. What can I do as a consumer? It's very, very difficult, I think, to find anything that doesn't come out of China.
Yes, I think we need to start going on Facebook and going on Twitter and asking these companies, can you reveal how exactly you're sourcing from these factories? Mm-hmm. How are you doing your audits? How much are you paying for audits? What kind of things are you looking for in your audits? Do you actually give your factories enough time to make these products? What happens if you want to make a production change because the trends are changing? Do you give your factories an extension or do you not? And they have no choice but to make it really fast turnaround. That's not actually possible. These are the questions we can ask companies. And if there's enough of us going on Twitter, going on Facebook to ask, they're going to have to respond and change some of their policies, because the last thing any corporation wants is our viral social media posts saying that they're not being sustainable.
Okay, that's great. So you also mentioned, so there was a specific NGO that was run by Harry Wu, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Can you talk about his organization? Is it still operating? Right.
It's the Law Guy Research Foundation, which was the original NGO doing research on the forced labor goods coming out of China. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, they have not been doing much since Mr. Wu passed away. He was quite old. He was in his 80s and just, he was so dedicated to the cause that he didn't even think that his time might be up or have a successor in hand. And so the organization kind of just fell apart after what I've been told from people who have left the organization. It fell apart after his death. So they're not around doing much these days. But the good news is we have a lot of other organizations stepping up in light of the Uyghur camps, including the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. They released a very good report documenting 82 big global corporations that are sourcing from Uyghur forced laborers through the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program. And these included, very expensive companies, including BMW and Mercedes-Benz.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of times the problem isn't even because the product is too cheap, but the companies are not, they have the money and the resources to do better, but nobody is actually pushing them to do better.
And that would have to come from consumers, right? So I know that there are a number of Uyghur activists who are basically in exile. They live in the United States or elsewhere, and they can't go home really. But is there a way that the Chinese government can pressure these activists who are living abroad?
Oh, yes. A lot of them have received threats to these kinds of activists who are very vocal abroad. They've received strange calls from their families who are still living in Xinjiang saying, please stop, you're endangering our lives. It's a tough situation. By speaking out about what's happening, you are, making it difficult for your family members in Xinjiang. And that's something I think about a lot because I'm actually part Uyghur and I'm trying to look for, unfortunately, my family has assimilated as Han Chinese completely, and we've lost touch with our Uyghur relatives in Xinjiang.
Oh, wow.
But I'm trying to find them, and if I can find out who they are and if they're okay or not, and if I find out some of them are in camps, I have to really think about, what can I do? Should I try to speak out and help get them out and improve their situations? Or would that be endangering the relatives that are not in camps and putting them in camps? Because the Chinese government is going to respond by pressuring me to stop talking, by putting more of my relatives in camps. Mm-hmm. So it's really a tough call about when to speak out and what to say at what point.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about some of the conditions in the Xinjiang camps? The kind of typical re-education that people are receiving at these camps.
Right. The difference between these re-education camps and something like a drug detox center was that everyone there has to learn Chinese. Mm-hmm. They have to sing patriotic songs, like praising Xi Jinping every day. They have to basically dismiss and erase their Uyghur ethnic identity and culture. Mm-hmm. A lot of them have to get forcibly sterilized in these camps. And if they resist, they are tortured.
Mm-hmm. And the purpose of these camps is basically to eradicate their ethnicity. Is that right?
Essentially, the Chinese policymakers have themselves said they would like to see a single state race, and having a Uyghur ethnicity really takes away from that.
Mm-hmm. So I know that the Chinese government, they've said that, the purpose of these re-education camps is because to prevent terrorism, right? So is there any evidence that there are significant Uyghur terrorism going on in Xinjiang?
I don't think so. There were some small scale violent attacks, but this is not a counterterrorism campaign because it targets way too many people. You have elderly people being arrested, elderly women, even children that are forced to separate from their parents. It's terror. This is just the U.S. government itself has said that this is not a counterterrorism strategy. It's simply too broad.
Mm-hmm. So there's just no national security purpose in doing this for China?
Not at all.
Okay. I was just curious, have you been to Xinjiang?
I wanted to go during my reporting, but I was warned not to by fellow journalists in China who said, you're not going to be able to get anything done. You're just going to get arrested once you get there and follow the entire time. Mm-hmm. Even people who are not journalists who are going there on tourism visas, who are actual tourists, are being followed the entire time if you're a foreigner in Xinjiang. So I unfortunately did not go to Xinjiang, but would very much like to sometime in the future.
Yeah, I've heard that in Xinjiang, there's police stops practically at every intersection. So it's pretty impossible to travel around Xinjiang at all.
Yes, I've heard that as well. I think a lot of people have to just rely on satellite imagery to document the expansion of the camps, which is what we're seeing a lot of these days.
Mm-hmm. Even though you're an American and you live in America, do you expect any threats either from the Chinese government because of what you've written about China?
I'm not expecting personal threats to me that would actually endanger my life in the U.S. But I've been thinking about it, and I'm very concerned about my family in China, how this would impact them. And I just want to say they had nothing to do with this book. They don't even really know what I've been working on. So It would be a shame if they got hurt in any way.
I just want to conclude by asking you, so for Americans like ourselves, you've written this fantastic book. It's shocking. I mean, the practices that you document in there are horrific. But for Americans like ourselves, having grown up in the U.S., why should we care about this issue?
Because I think the way that we buy products and what we choose to buy can directly influence whether a factory will use this kind of forced labor or whether they will use regular workers that they're paying properly. So we do have a say in how our companies are sourcing from these factories and how their factories are actually doing business. So that's why we should care.
Okay, thank you. Well, that was a fantastic conversation, and I think you've really shone a light on an issue that needs a lot of light on it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Professor Bennett. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Send us an email at podcasts@c-span.org.